Zach, really appreciate you taking some time today.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Well, listen, can we kick off the conversation here by you telling listeners a little bit more about how you got into, racing and then, of course, ultra marathon racing?
Yeah, it was, my relationship with running, I guess, dates back to middle school when they used to do the presidential physical fitness challenges. And I kind of found out through that and just track and field day that if I wanted to get my butt kicked, I'd sign up for the 100-meter dash. If I wanted a chance to win, I'd sign up for the mile. So
Nice, nice.
that kind of got me interested in that. And I started kind of taking it a little more seriously as I got a little more into high school and, was on a structured cross country and track team and, had some coaches who kind of understood the philosophies and training methodologies that went with more standard distance track and field and cross country stuff. And I started getting pretty interested in it by the end of high school and early college, and then ultimately ended up running 3 years of cross country and 2 years of indoor and outdoor track and field for the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, which is a D3 school in the WEAC conference, kind of in the Midwest, the United States. And that's where I probably learned the most about some of the ins and outs of periodizing for races and kind of structuring your training and stuff around the actual event you're trying to prepare for, and just getting really specific for that sort of thing. And after college, one thing I learned from that experience was that from an enjoyment standpoint, I liked the longer run stuff. So like at the end of the week, when I would look back at what run or workout I enjoyed the most, it was typically the long run. So I think it was maybe unknowing at the time, but I was probably earmarked for ultra marathons at that point. And then the couple of years after college, I spent a decent amount of time, a couple of years, just kind of building up my volume of training and just, I guess, really establishing that base. And then ultimately that led to my first ultra marathon at the end of 2010. And then my first full, I guess, season of ultra marathon racing was at the end of 2011. And then in 2012 onward, I basically focused all my kind of training and stuff around specifically ultra marathon type distances.
That's awesome. And Zach, after that first ultra marathon race, were you hooked at that point, or was there some kind of catalyst along the way that really, when you knew that this was the distance and sport for you?
Yeah, I was definitely hooked. I was also probably also aware that I had kind of jumped into the sport maybe a little quicker than I had originally intended. After college, I was more or less familiar with ultramarathon, but I would just tell myself I'll do some more traditional distance stuff, and then maybe when I'm 30, I'll start doing some ultramarathon stuff. And it happened to be that first one I did, I was 25, so I walked away from it very optimistic. I actually won the event, so that was encouraging. And
to say the least, right?
yeah, that helps. That helps with the motivation side of things, I think, a little bit. And but I was also, historically, I was more informed with just standard distance stuff, so I hadn't really necessarily let go of that yet at the time. And I didn't really know if I necessarily wanted to go all in on ultra marathons quite yet at that point. But by the end of the next year, when I did that same event again, and then a couple other ones, I was pretty much hooked. So then by 2012, I started planning my entire calendar around just more specifics to training for ultra marathons, getting a little more informed as to what everyone else in that sport was doing, and what was maybe the best way for me personally to kind of get prepared for specific events and different distances and terrains within that sport.
Nice. And Zach, as you move into ultra marathons, does your training philosophy, did it change at all in terms of, are there some layers there that came on, or is it simply an extension of what you'd been building up to in your collegiate days running distance?
Yeah, what I usually tell folks is all the variables of running are more or less still there. It just kind of tends to be a little different in the way you structure them, or you line them up, and then it changes a little bit on which ones are maybe a little more emphasized. So when it comes to kind of structuring a training plan, I still favor kind of a periodized approach to training. But I do that with the understanding or overreaching kind of philosophy that specificity is going to be king. So when I say specificity, I'm kind of referring to like the distance itself as well as the intensity that is going to be used during that performance. Mm-hmm. So the way sometimes it almost kind of looks like a typical endurance program almost backwards, where since race pace can sometimes be slower than even your easy run pace, you're kind of in this position where almost everything you do in training is like overspeed training. Whereas,
yeah, it's interesting.
It gets kind of weird. But then like if I was going to do a 5K, I might do 10% or so of my training volume, 10 to 20% at race pace, and everything else is going to kind of be more aerobic development and things like that. Whereas with the 100-mile distance, it's basically entirely aerobic. So then I still think there's value in doing some of those shorter, intense, like VO2 max type workouts. They just aren't specific to race pace itself. So I tend to put them earlier in the training plan. And then as I get closer to the race itself, I start doing things that are a little more specific to the pace I'm actually going to be doing at that event.
And Zach, how far out would you, start your training for a 100-mile event?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Usually, I say about 6 months is ideal if you're starting kind of from scratch, or if I'm going to be doing an event that I'm not too familiar with, in the sense that it's not the same. It's not as similar to the training block I just came off of. I can usually tighten that down to about 4 months if I'm doing like a similar event to the one I had just competed at. I'm just going to have a little more, I guess, specificity lingering around from that previous training block. So usually that 4 to 6 months is usually kind of a good time. And what I'll usually end up doing is picking 2 or 3 kind of goal races during the year, and then kind of build up towards those. And everything else I do from a race standpoint are what I would call kind of a B race or a C race, where I want to get a good effort in, but maybe not at like a complete go to the well 100% exhaustion kind of a scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for folks listening in who, might not be as familiar with some of the ultramarathon programming, could you walk us through maybe a sample week of what that might look like in terms of your training as you build up for an event?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And, for me, I fall in the camp of probably someone who's a high volume trainer. I tend to do well with quite a bit of volume in my training. I mean, there's guys and gals who do more, but more often than not, I'm kind of at the higher end of that. And usually what that means is when I kind of get into the peak of training, I'm hitting weeks of upwards of maybe 20 hours of like running and some strength work, mobility work, and things like that. And depending on the terrain, that can be, I've had training weeks that have gone upwards to above 150 miles per week. And it's just kind of consistency within that framework. So when I describe volume, I usually try to tell folks like you got to start where you're at. So like, for me to do 15 hours a week of running or something like that, that comes on kind of the backbone of years and years of gradually working up to that. So had I done that kind of in my early days, I'd probably be out of the sport by now. So,
and that's really important point for a lot of trainers, and if there's recreational runners listening in, right? Because that's often something that kind of gets missed in even the marathon prep and things like that. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to balance life too. Like there's a lot of other variables to consider when you're deciding whether, adding more volume or adding more intensity to your program is actually going to be a net benefit versus just, driving yourself into the ground or putting yourself in a position to get hurt or overtrained. So, I like to call it in my own training and with athletes I work with, the goal is to micro stress. So we're going to try to do just enough to get a response, but not so much that we're going to have to use additional days to recover from that are going to pull from future workouts. And, that can be a pretty wide range. I might have someone coming to me who's historically, doesn't train much above, 5 to 8 hours a week. So for someone like that, I'm not going to schedule them like a 15-hour training week. They may get to that over the course of a couple of years if they have that kind of flexibility within their schedule, but it's not an all or nothing situation. It's what I found kind of works well for me, and I've been fortunate enough to kind of have the flexibility to put that sort of time commitment into it as well. So from a day-to-day standpoint in training, usually I skew the bulk of my work to the morning. I'll wake up in the morning and I'll do some like kind of computer work, emails and stuff like that for an hour or so just to kind of wake up and kind of get my body moving a little bit. And then I'll go out and do the kind of the bulk of my running training that morning. And if it's depending on what phase of the training plan it's in, that might be the only run of the day. If it's in kind of the peak phase of training, I might be in kind of a 2-a-day mode where I'll do another run in the afternoon or go to the gym and do some strength work, some mobility work. But typically the more emphasized keystone workout is done in the AM.
Nice. And, with respect to even your short runs, how long are the short runs even?
Yeah, it can be relative, I guess. Sometimes I'll take a complete rest day sometimes, or usually the shortest I'll go before I just decide it's not worth going at all is probably 40 minutes or so. It's pretty rare that I'll go less than that unless it's like a run the day before a big race or something like that, where I'm just trying to kind of stay in a routine but not induce any type of physical breakdown.
For sure. And Zach, how does your training age or an elite ultra marathoner's training age impact this? How far out you start from an event, or how you're sort of periodizing things. Does that allow you? You've touched on this a little bit, but does that allow you to kind of come in and out a little bit with more, room to maneuver, so to speak, versus someone who's got to build up those hours in the week?
Yeah, I think so. Usually what I use is kind of a metric to decide like where I'm at and when to kind of move on to the next phase of training. Is I'll start by building a big foundation at kind of like a maximum aerobic function. So for me, my max heart rate is right around the low 190s. So for me, when I'm trying to really develop that strong aerobic foundation, I'm hitting efforts that are usually right around 150 to maybe 155 beats per minute. And what I'll do is I'll start building volume within that framework of about 150 to 155 beats per minute. And what I'll be watching is I'll be watching my pace to kind of drop when I can hold all the variables as much as possible constant there. And historically, usually when I'm really aerobically fit, I can get my pace down to about 6 flat, maybe a little under that, but around 5:55 minutes per mile.
Wow.
And when I have that point there, historically I'll plateau, and then it's time to then I know I kind of have that aerobic foundation in place, and then I can kind of start building some of those other things onto that. So from a timing standpoint, it can depend a bit. Like I've had training blocks where, I go out for the first week and, within a couple of weeks, I'm already down to there. So then I can kind of get into some of the meat of the schedule a little earlier if I want to. Sometimes it's just about, as you probably know, like just timing it just right. Because when you get to that kind of peak fitness, you can hold that for a while. But ultimately, you have to let that go at some point and do like a relative defitting just so you don't run yourself into the ground by trying to stay at your peak form year round. But that's kind of my starting point is getting that strong aerobic base developed. And then I can, the way I'd like to describe it is once I get as fit as I can in that environment, whatever direction I want to go, whether it would be a 5K or a 100-mile, I can build off of that foundation really nicely.
Amazing. And you just competed recently in a 100-miler in San Diego, I believe, right? And I think that people don't exactly expect a 100-mile race to come down to the wire, but can you walk listeners through what happened there?
Yeah, that was maybe one of the more exciting events I've done within ultra running so far. It was the San Diego 100-mile this past weekend, and I went in there with a pretty good buildup, I would say, and ultimately I had a pretty good idea of kind of what was a reasonable target, and I stuck to the race plan. And the way it kind of played out is I was kind of yo-yoing back and forth between first and second place for the first 21 miles or so, and then at around, there's an aid station about 21 and a half miles, and Chris Hames, one of the other competitors in the race, pulled away a little bit. He was just moving through aid stations a little faster than I was in the early stages, so I'd usually come into the aid station a bit ahead of him, and then he'd come in after and just get through really quick, and I'd spend maybe a minute or two longer, and then I'd slowly start to catch back up. But at that aid station at 21 and a half, he pulled away, and I didn't catch back up, and I just kind of let him go and stuck to my plan. And by the time I got to one of the key aid stations at mile 65, I think he had a 22 or 23 minute lead on me. So I knew I was gonna have to start kind of chipping away at that soon, or I'd run out of time essentially. And
Absolutely.
it was kind of a unique environment. The San Diego 100's in what they would consider probably a high desert climate, so it gets pretty hot relative to the time of year, and it's pretty exposed. So heat is definitely a factor, and something that you can account for needing to be smart about, which usually just means kind of cooling down a lot in aid stations, getting ice and lowering that core temp through external like wetness versus just trying to drink as much as you possibly can.
Yeah.
So I was,
once you overheat, it's tough to turn back, right?
yeah, right. In fact, at one point during that race, I actually there's a couple really small streams that you could kind of like rock hop over if you wanted to stay dry, but I took a little bit of time just kind of cooling off in those, and even taking a bottle of kind of the cool stream water and dumping it on my head at one point, just to kind of keep those core temps as low as I could during the heat of the day.
Nice.
But some of it was like, I've done enough relatively warm events too, where I kind of know, like, if you take care of yourself during the day and make sure you don't get behind on hydration and electrolytes, that when the temps do drop, you kind of find another gear. So part of me was, during the heat of the day, was just focusing on staying on top of that stuff. And then ultimately, when those temps would drop, I thought that when I would try to make a move. So right around mile 75, the temperatures broke a bit, and I felt like I kind of had that extra gear or a little bit more motivation. And then I started kind of pushing a bit. And since I had stayed hydrated more or less, I didn't really have to play catch up at all. So at that point, I started just making really efficient moves through aid stations, and I would get in and out in less than 30 seconds in most cases. So actually, when you look at kind of the pacing of the race, I probably made up more time by just getting through aid stations quicker at the end than I did actually running faster than Chris. So I chipped away at that 23-minute lead by moving through those aid stations quick, and then running, maybe 10, 15 seconds per mile faster than him, and eventually caught him at the last aid station in mile 91 and a half, and we ran together.
91 and a half, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was pretty exciting to kind of have a situation like that, and ultimately I finished, I think, 2 minutes and 40 seconds ahead of Chris, and
which is really tight, isn't it, for a race of that length?
Yeah, it is. You rarely feel, I think, like you can find some really competitive races where it may be just a situation where if you speed up, you'll catch someone, or if you slow down, you'll get caught by someone. But in a lot of cases, there's enough events now where at the 100-mile distance in North America, there might be, you might have a 30-minute lead or be behind by 30 minutes when you get to that point, and just know, like, if you speed up, you're not going to catch anyone. If you slow down, the person behind you likely won't catch you, and it gets a lot easier in that situation just to kind of go to cruise control and get it done, versus a race like that where you kind of feel like you're chasing or being chased for a good portion or a longer portion, which can just be maybe a little more mentally fatiguing than a different situation.
Yeah, I was going to say that the technical and tactical demands of ultra are pretty significant as well, right? Depending on the terrain that you're in, and of course, as you just mentioned, your strategy around how you're going to race. Are there, for you, does that evolve from race to race significantly? Or are there certain themes that are pretty consistent for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's definitely some tactics, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. I remember I did a race a couple years ago called the Javelina 100 in 2017, and that's another kind of desert race that can get pretty warm. And I'd won that event the year before, and it had course record temps of 102.
Wow.
And my strategy on that day was actually, since it was going to be a little cooler for the first few hours in the morning, I ran a little faster than what I thought I could sustain, just because I wanted to cover a little more ground while the temperatures were lower, and then pull back a little during the heat of the day. And then, kind of like I explained before, hopefully get a bit of a second wind when the temps come back down near the end of or near sunset. And that worked pretty well. So the next year I tried it again, but with a little more of an emphasis on a quick start because the field was just a little more competitive. And one of the guys there that I thought was probably the biggest or the best chance to kind of beat me that day was it was his first 100 miler. So I thought, the learning curve for 100 miles can be tough because a lot of times folks will go to the 100-kilometer distance, so like 62 and a half miles, and the next step is 100 miles, which leaves a lot of unknown with 37 and a half miles.
Yeah, wow.
So my thought was like a quick start would maybe make it a little more difficult for someone who's never kind of solved that puzzle yet. But that ended up possibly backfiring on me a little bit where the guy who beat me, Pat Reagan, he's a good friend, but he held strong. So he responded to the tactic that I put in and thrived under it, where I thought he would maybe struggle a little bit. So wow. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And but it's part of the sport, and I think it's kind of fun to know, like, especially when you get some of the more competitive fields where it's not necessarily just your decision from a competitive standpoint. Sometimes you have to respond to what's going on, as well as balance out what you think will end up working out by the end of the race too.
Yeah, I mean, imagine all those different variables and the psychology of it all as well in terms of the mindset piece. And, I imagine there could be a certain amount of discomfort going on as you're running 100 miles. Like how big is the mindset at the elite level, maybe versus say the recreational level?
Yeah, I think there's some parallels as well as maybe some differences. I think like when you're at the tip of the spear or the elite level, you're maybe more likely to run someone else's race because you feel like you have to, versus if you're kind of in the middle of the pack and you have this idea of like, well, I have to run my race and that's how I'm going to get my best result and I can't worry about anyone else. Mm-hmm. And to a degree, I think the elite crowd can maybe learn a bit from that mentality in the middle of the pack, because it doesn't always, like, if you find yourself in a position where in order to win you have to do something that is next to impossible or impossible, you have to ask yourself how realistic your goal is, I guess, at that point, and adjust accordingly. And that gets maybe a little more difficult to navigate when you have a chance to win or you're on track to be on the podium, just to decide how much you want to roll the dice to try to have, say, your best possible race versus just a very solid race that will end with at least a good result. So like that mental component I think is really big, especially when you get to the latter stages of some of these longer events, because when you look at just the pacing of some of these events, like nothing about even the fast miles within them are really that relatively fast compared to what you could do at any given moment. So then it ultimately just becomes how focused can you stay to be on that pace that you need to do in order to get there. And that can sometimes be the determining factor as to whether you have a good finish or, a subpar finish, is like how motivated are you to kind of push your body at those lower intensities after you've been out there for a long time and your brain and your mind are kind of fatiguing from just the act of how long it is.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. The duration. I'm obviously got a lot of endurance athletes listening in, recreational, trying to be more elite, and coaches as well. And they're, I'm sure chomping at the bit to be asking you questions around how they could improve their performance. So maybe the best way to ask this is, what are some common mistakes that you might see with clients that you work with that are in that sort of, perhaps sub-elite is maybe the better way to describe them, but, who are really trying to push the performance side of things? What are some common, errors or pitfalls or gaps in their training?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is kind of diverging from where they're at and their circumstances are and trying to like more or less do what someone else is doing. I think you see that a lot where, especially nowadays when we have so much access to everyone from social media, and then that bleeds right even into the training aspect. You have programs like Strava where you can see what everyone's doing and really get hung up on what someone else is training for versus what you are, and where they're at versus where you are. And that can be difficult, I think, for some folks where, they may have a rest day planned and they open up Strava and see, oh, well, my buddy just did this awesome tempo run and nailed it. And then they want to go out there and do the same thing. Or,
For sure.
someone stole their segment on Strava. So even though they're supposed to do an easy day, they go out there and do a workout instead. So I think sometimes getting like not following the plan for themselves is a big one. Another one I think is just the consistency factor. Sometimes people get hung up with what they think they should be doing, and they try to force that into the context of their life, and it just doesn't fit. And they would have done better ultimately if they just were consistent within the time they did have versus trying to do everything to the way they think is right, but ultimately it just becomes too much. And I think that's just something we see in a lot of contexts of life, even where people see where they want to be, and then they try to get there too fast, and then they don't necessarily do it the right way, and it doesn't end up being sustainable for them long term.
100%. I mean, great advice. And, you mentioned kind of people struggling to keep up with even the training volume and the amount of hours required. And obviously endurance sport itself is, more prone to kind of colds and flu and infection. And obviously seemingly ultra would be more so that way, or maybe the folks that decide to do ultra are just more naturally robust. But for yourself, are there any strategies around, keeping cold and flu free, or symptoms that you might start to feel where you say, okay, time to back off a little bit?
Yeah, I think from just like staying like healthy from a cold and flu standpoint, for me, it's always been sleep is huge. Like I find like, I typically I don't get sick very often. I don't get colds all that often, but when I do, it usually is because I, burned the candle on both ends a couple days in a row and just tried to kind of stay on top of everything when I needed to just kind of scale something back and make sure I got enough sleep. So I think that's one that oftentimes gets overlooked because people don't always think of the rest component as the point where their body's actually making the progress. They think of the actual act of doing the workout, which actually is just, as you know, that's the breaking down portion of it. The building up, getting stronger portion of it is the doing nothing, the resting, the sleeping, taking care of that side of the spectrum. And it probably parallels with what I was saying before too, where it can be hard to respect rest when you see everyone else out there, doing a big workout or something like that. And I think keeping a level head with that is an important thing from both the health standpoint as well as actually getting what you want out of the training side of things.
Yeah, it's such a great point because especially with endurance, you can really see, like you mentioned, what people are doing in terms of mileage and everything else. And it can be, for a lot of type A's, I imagine, pretty tough to stick to their own plans. So that's great advice there. And if we shift gears here on the nutrition side, Zach, for you, again, example, you're building up for San Diego 100-miler. Can you give us a little glimpse on what the training nutrition looks like in a block, and then maybe juxtapose that with, your race day fueling and how that actually plays out in comparison?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that'll probably highlight a bit about how I periodize my training as well when we get into the nutrition stuff. So, for me, I found out I think it was the end of about 2011 that I thought like a semblance of the high fat, low carb diet would be something that'd be useful for my endeavors within ultra marathon. So I kind of started exploring that and experimenting with that at the end of that year, and found that it was working quite well. And I just have been essentially evolving how I use that within the context of my training throughout the year. So I think it sometimes can be a point of confusion for folks, because if you look at my training or if you look at my lifestyle, it can be drastically different during different points of the year. So like if you looked at my entire calendar and picked one day out of there, if you pick the day after a big race, then, I might not be doing anything physically active, and I might not be eating any carbohydrates that day. Whereas you pick out a day where it's like one of my biggest training blocks or a race day or something like that, someone who is following a strict ketogenic diet might look at what I'm eating and think, oh, well, he's eating high amounts of carbohydrates or more carbohydrates than I would expect someone who's quote unquote high fat, low carb. And I think that's you just need to have that placed in the context to really understand what's going on there. So the way I kind of try to describe it is like, as my training volume and intensity increases, I'll bring my carbohydrate intake up a bit. It's still relatively low to what you're going to probably see in most endurance training programs that are more or less probably advocate advocate for like 60 to 70% of your intake to come from a carbohydrate source, whereas mine typically peaks at around 20%. There's a few days during the year where I'll maybe get up to 30%. But even that sometimes I think a little bit confusing or just needs to be unpacked a little further, because typically when my carbohydrate percentage of intake is that high, it's not necessarily indicative of the ratios of like glucose to fat that I'm metabolizing on that day, mainly just because when I get to a workout that big, I'm almost certainly going to run a calorie deficit on that day and account for it in the next couple of days when I'm doing less. So for example, if I have like a long run that's like 30 to 35 miles, I might eat 20 to 30% carbohydrate that day, but I also might run like a calorie deficit of say 1,000 calories just from the sheer workload.
Yeah.
So then that's going to be a combination of fat and glucose that's going to get metabolized in that deficit. And then that next day, if I run 30 to 35 miles one day, I might take a complete rest day the next day. So that day I might go down to like no carbohydrates essentially. So I'm making up that deficit on the rest day with a lot of fats and proteins and things like that. So there's a little bit of ebb and flow or periodization with it, and I try to kind of time it right so that I can utilize carbohydrates as kind of a performance advantage when I need it, but not lean on it as the kind of the foundation of my nutrition.
Nice. And in terms of protein intake, Zach, do you sort of set your protein intake at a certain amount, or would that fluctuate a little bit for you depending on what type of training block you're in?
Yeah, I would get more protein during kind of peak training just due to the relatively higher amount of intake I would be bringing in. But as a minimum, I usually aim for about like 150 grams a day. And then when I'm really active and eating more, I'm sure I get up well above that. But even on like a rest day, I'm going to hit probably at least 150 grams per day. Some of that's based on, I've done it differently in the past. I've tried to bring protein down at times. But it just seems like after talking to, guys like Professor Don Lehman and Professor Stu Phillips and Professor Jose Antonio, on the podcast I co-host, it seems like especially with active individuals, if anything, our protein recommendations are on the conservative side, and we should be aiming for kind of that higher end of the current recommendations, if not going a little bit above that. So I've been more relaxed, I would say, in the last year or two on how high I'll let the protein get. And I think typically that would probably ends up being around 20% of my intake.
Yeah, it is amazing how, especially for endurance sport or ultra, especially, the amount of bricks you're going through, as Prof. Phillips likes to say, you definitely need a lot of bricks to replace that. So that's pretty cool to hear. And then, as you get into race day fueling, then can you give us, without giving out any trade secrets there to your competition, any highlights on what you might aim for in terms of per hour, or if there's a certain general strategy when you're going about these races?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I look at it is I try to look at race day fueling as kind of two fuel tanks, more or less. So most of your listeners, I think, will probably easily understand, like you have like your fat stores that you can burn, and then you have your glycogen that you can, in terms of onboard fueling. Mm-hmm. So the fat stores are the unexhaustible fuel tank. Like even if I went out and ran 100 miles and didn't eat a thing, at a super lean state, even if I was like as lean as I would be able to get from a performance standpoint without getting too lean, I'd have enough onboard fat to get through that event if I had to. Probably not ideal, but that fuel tank is not going to be one where I have to worry about depleting during the event itself. So I think sometimes people think, well, if you're a high fat, low carb athlete or a keto athlete, then what fueling you would do would be within those parameters of, eating a lot of fat and very little, if no, carbohydrate. And I tell folks that the advantage of using fat as a primary fuel source is so that you don't have to eat as much, because you just have more access to some of that onboard fuel from that standpoint. So you're saving yourself from having to ingest fats during the race because your body's good enough at, burning that at a high enough rate during the event itself. And so that just basically leaves like your glycogen stores, which is the fuel tank that I think you can deplete as people who've bonked in a race know quite
Exactly right.
quite well. So that's the one I'm gonna try to kind of keep an eye on during a race itself. So what I do is I'll do, usually it ends up being right around 150 to at most usually about 200 calories per hour of a carbohydrate source during the event itself. And for folks curious about kind of where that comes from, essentially, like when I was a high carb athlete before I even paid any attention to a low fat or a high fat, low carb approach, I'd be routinely taking in 300 plus calories per hour. So basically my goal at that point when I switched was to be able to lower that need down to something that I felt was a lot less risky in terms of dealing with any type of digestive issues that you're going to maybe come across if you're trying to take in, upwards of 300 calories per hour.
Yeah, digestion definitely seems to be one that comes around all the time when we talk about things like marathons and endurance, and I imagine for ultras as well. Is that something that you see with other elite runners? Is that have they got that dialed in compared to more recreational runners, recreational ultra marathoners who are trying to figure out that part of the equation?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a variable. It kind of goes back to what when we were talking about in the beginning, where all those variables to running are kind of there when you do ultras versus more traditional distances, but some of them tend to skew a little more important than maybe they would be. So when you think of like a 5K race, in race fueling is a non-issue. Like you're just not going to do it, or if you do, you're I don't know why you would be.
Yeah, you got enough to go, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So then all of a sudden that variable becomes something you need to consider when you're doing, say, 100 miles. And that can be that. Usually what I tell folks is like your need to follow a high fat, low carb diet is possibly dependent on how well you can fuel during an event. And there's guys and gals who are putting down a ton of food and they don't seem to be having issues with it. And then there's also guys and gals who, if they're eating more than like, say 100 calories an hour, they're getting stomach issues. So usually when I'm having a conversation with someone in terms of whether they should even go after a high fat, low carb approach or stick to a higher carb, let's look at what's your relative need for that. So if I'm talking to someone who's like, well, I can take in 300 grams of carbohydrate per hour, no problem. I've never had stomach issues. It's probably not as needed for them.
That's terrific, Zach. Now, in terms of things like supplementation, is there anything that that's a real consistent aspect of your nutrition strategy in terms of supplementation, in terms of a training block, as well as, even on race day?
Yeah, I think the one that sticks out the most is just electrolytes. One thing I recognized when I first started doing a lower carb approach was that you can almost if you let your electrolytes kind of slack, you can almost feel like your energy levels are really low, similar to like just if you were bonking from a carbohydrate depleted state within the context of like following a high carb diet. So it's always amazing to me how much like sodium I can actually eat. And I mean, I don't record it all the time. I tend to be a little more intuitive with it, but I have in the past just to get a ballpark idea of what I'm doing and taking in. And I've had training blocks where, I'm maybe taking in 10 to 12 milligrams of sodium per day just in like meals and things like that. So when the weather gets warm, I'm doing a lot of electrolyte supplementation. Usually I'll just use an electrolyte product that I have by a company called X Endurance that they just make like a powder that you can put into like, water and drink it with that. So I'm just trying to be mindful if I'm drinking a lot of water due to thirst to be adding some of that in there too, so I don't dilute that too much.
For sure.
So that's kind of the big one that I've focused on as something I need to stay on top of if I want my workouts to go well and if I want to feel good with the approach I'm following. In terms of other supplementation type stuff, I don't necessarily lean on anything. I try to get most of that through diet and nutrition. And sometimes I think it's almost easier when you're in peak training because you're just eating so much. It's like you can almost account for more because you're due to the sheer volume.
The amount of food you're putting down is pretty significant, right?
Yeah. But I'll also do like every once in a while, like especially if I'm like on the road or something like that. I might have like a multivitamin or something like that just to make sure I'm not getting too low on something that would be pivotal, but not a whole lot of like super strong structure routine with that. And, some of that's just because I haven't had a huge experience in terms of having like low levels of any specific thing that I felt like I need to kind of get caught up on. So.
And any ergogenics, like caffeine, is that part of your race day fueling at all, or is that something that at those distances maybe you don't need as much?
Yeah, no, I definitely lean on some caffeine. I'm a cup of coffee in the morning kind of guy right out the gate, so
Nice.
that usually ends up in there. And during races itself, what I found that I think the science would point to this as well, is that in most individuals, caffeine is going to be a performance advantage. And since it's perfectly legal to take in caffeine during a race, I don't hesitate to do that. I'm a little more mindful of how much I'm taking in if it's hot, because if it's really hot, sometimes the caffeine can kind of be a kiss of death, so to speak. So just kind of being careful about that when it gets really warm. But I'll do I really like yerba mate for caffeine sources during races, and partly just
Nice.
because I more or less stumbled upon this accidentally. I can't remember when yerba mate came on my radar, but I remember trying it once and feeling like it was just a little different than like if you have like a cup of coffee, where I felt like you had like almost this calm sense of energy versus
not quite
just
as edgy, right?
Yeah, not, you don't run that risk of kind of having a little too much and then being jittery and kind of having this big burst of energy and then a crash. It's just a little more kind of like low or slow delivery, I guess. So usually I'll use some yerba mate. Like there's a company called Unicity that makes like a little sachet packet that's pretty easy for transportation. I don't have to like get out the gourd and the loose leaf tea or anything like that.
I was going to say that must be tough to handle when you're running at that speed.
Yeah, well, when I first started using it in races, I wasn't aware of any kind of like easy kind of instant version of that. So I would sometimes brew it up ahead of time and then just put it in like a little concentrate and sip at that. But that's just a little more of a hurdle, I guess, or a logistical thing to deal with. So I'm thankful that there's easier products now.
Absolutely. And if we ask you the same question on the nutrition front here for the recreational ultramarathoner who's trying to up their game a little bit, what are some common mistakes that you might see in clients that you're coaching?
Did you from the nutritional standpoint or just in general?
Yeah, from the nutrition side of things.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when people come to me with looking for advice from the nutrition side, they're coming to me with already like some intrigue within a high fat, low carb approach to training. And one of the biggest mistakes I think I see people doing is they'll read about someone or read a study that says like this can be an advantage for you, and they'll buy in, but they'll buy in at the wrong time. So they'll be like midway through a training program, and then they'll do a massive overhaul to their nutrition, and then it's just going to go badly for them at that point in most cases. So just finding the right timing is usually one of the biggest first mistakes. And usually I say the best time to do it is, finish your key race of the year or the season. And then when you're kind of in that off season mode, that's the best time to do any type of dietary overhaul or nutritional overhaul. Then give yourself a chance to kind of adapt to that while your stress levels from a physical side of things are a little bit on the lower end of the scale. And that usually fixes a lot of the problems there. Another big one I'll see too with endurance athletes is actually I'll have say someone, they'll sign up for like a consult call with me, and they'll be training for like a triathlon or something like that, and they'll explain like what their workload is, and they'll be relatively high volume with even some periodized intensity in there, and they feel like they don't quite have that last gear, and they'll think I'm going to tell them they need to eliminate the 30 grams of carbohydrate they do have in their diet. And then usually they're a little bit more relieved when I say, well, let's try inching that up a little bit. And, finding that kind of sweet spot, I think is a hurdle for a lot of people to get over, just because when people look at like what fat adapted is, which can be kind of a nebulous term, I guess. But a lot of times they're looking at things like grams per day or millimoles of ketones in their blood, and maybe get a little too hung up on that versus how do I have a low carb, high fat diet where I also feel like I can do all the workouts. And from my experience, when you add in that context of just a really active, high charging athlete type of lifestyle, the metrics maybe need to shift a little bit from what we have advocated for in terms of just like a therapeutic ketogenic diet or a more classical ketogenic diet. So a lot of times with those folks, we can usually fix that pretty quickly. We just up their carbohydrates a little bit. So if they were at, say, like 30 to 50 grams a day, we try out 100 and we see how they feel with that. If they get that last gear back, or maybe it's 150 grams. And usually what they find out there is like, their carbohydrate intake is still awfully low relative to most folks. So they're still asking their body to metabolize a lot of fat in order to provide their energy for the day and their workouts. So they're still going to be, further along that scale in terms of being good at utilizing that fuel substrate, but not so far over to the scale that it's coming at a complete compromise of their ability to process any type of glucose, intake during a workout or during a race either. So usually it just comes down to kind of like spelling it out for folks so they don't think it's this all or nothing thing where I can either be as fat adapted as possible or as carb dependent as possible. Like there's a lot of middle ground there, and sometimes just finding that is, I think, a hurdle that people don't always get.
Yeah, such a great point. I mean, it's easy to get myopic a little bit, isn't it, for people? And when we're in the thick of it and they're looking at various metrics and not be able to zoom out to that 30,000 feet to really look at the whole training block and what they're trying to accomplish. And just as you mentioned, in terms of these, depending on what the workout demands are, then your fueling is going to change. So that's terrific. And listen, I appreciate you carving out so much time here, Zach. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So last question here for you. For you this year, or in the near future, what are some of the goals left for you to achieve here? What's next for you?
Yeah, I actually have a pretty exciting year this year. I'm doing a race out in Greece called the Spartathlon, which is one of the more historic events within the ultra running community, and it's a race from Athens to Sparta that's 153 miles, kind of on hillier roads. So my
Cool.
wife, her former name is Kalidropoulos, so people usually don't miss the fact that she's quite Greek.
Nice.
So we're both actually going out to do that race this September, which will be fun. I mean, I think in terms of other things down the road, I don't think I've ran my fastest 100-mile yet, so I'd like to see how much faster I could get at that, given a good setup. And another event that kind of intrigues me is just this 24-hour timed event where you just see how far you can get in 24 hours. And that's I've done a couple of them without much success. So I think trying to solve that puzzle has been really interesting for me too.
That's awesome. And Zach, how much longer until the 100-milers are in the Olympics here? What's the holdup?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they got 50K race walking. You'd think they'd throw in a ultra marathon run. I actually was thinking about this not too long ago, and the one that it would actually make, I think if it ever did, it would most likely be 100K road. And the reason for that is there's already kind of a structure there for that, because they do 100K road championships every other year.
Okay.
So like they kind of would have a protocol for it, and it would be, I think the hard part about ultra running is to standardize it for an Olympic sport would be tough, because if you do anything that's kind of trail or mountain oriented, it would just be such a massive home field advantage for whatever country's hosting. So that would maybe be tricky, but if you have something that's a little more consistent, like 100K with 10-kilometer loops or something like that on a road, pretty much everyone has access to that training environment close enough where if they get out there early enough, it shouldn't be that big of a difference. But I guess with that logic too, the 24-hour could make it in, because there's a world championships for that too. And that might be long enough, or that might be a further separation from the marathon. That'd be more intriguing, because then it's not just kind of going one step up. It's diving into full on kind of ultra marathon at that point.
Absolutely. Awesome. Listen, Zach, appreciate you carving out the time here today. Where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all your fantastic training and research?
Cool. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me on, Mark. Yeah, they can find me probably the one-stop shop would be my website at zachbitter.com, ZACHBITTER.com. And I'm probably most active on Instagram. So if folks want to reach out on there too, they can find me at ZachBitter on Instagram.